Her stillborn's birthday passed alone every year for a decade. A Lakota chief sat with her all day. The crow came down on the fence post same as always. Every year. That bird or one that looked exactly like it, same oil-black feathers, same way of tilting its head like it already knew the answer to a question you hadn't asked yet. I watched it from the tree line. Had been watching it for maybe 10 minutes before she came out the cabin door. She didn't see me. She never did first thing in the morning on that day. She walked to the grave like the ground was something she had to be careful with. Like maybe the earth under her feet was more fragile than she knew it to be. The grave was not far from the cabin, 10, 12 paces from the east-facing wall, in a patch of ground she had cleared and kept clear, no weeds, no grass, the soil dark and turned over recent. There was a flat stone. She'd found it down by the creek and carried it up herself, years back before I knew her. The stone had a name on it, but I won't say the name here. That was hers to carry. She crouched down next to the stone and put her hand flat on it. She stayed like that a long time. I am not a man who cries easily. I don't say that to make myself sound hard. I say it because it's true, and because what I am about to tell you asks for the truth, the whole shape of it, even the parts that don't reflect well on me. I stood in those trees, and I felt something move through my chest that I didn't have a word for in either language I spoke. I had 2 languages by then, Lakota and English both, and neither one had a word for what I was looking at. My name is Chayton. Most of the white settlers in that valley called me Charlie, which I allowed. A few of the older ones called me Chief, which was accurate but felt strange in their mouths, like they were trying on a coat that didn't fit them. My father had been a chief before me, his father before that. The title passed through our line the way river water passes through a canyon, not chosen so much as shaped by what it runs through. I had ridden into that valley 7 years before, not as an enemy. The wars were older than people remembered by then, the treaties signed, the land arranged by men in rooms I had never seen. My band had wintered in the hills east of here for 2 generations, and we came down into the valley for trade and sometimes for the spring pasture. The settlers knew us. Most of them weren't afraid, or if they were, they kept it somewhere private and showed us only their business faces. That was fine. I didn't need their comfort. I needed fair dealings and room to move, and for the most part in that valley I had both. I had met the woman, her name was Marta Dillon, 3 years after she arrived. Her husband had been dead 2 seasons already by then, fell from a horse and hit his head on a rock, gone before she could get a doctor from town. She was running the place alone. The cabin, the 2 horses, a small herd of cattle she'd built back up from almost nothing. People talked about her the way people talk about a thing they can't quite categorize. A woman alone on 40 acres, running her own cattle, not looking to remarry, not asking for help from the town. Some of them admired it. Some of them were made uncomfortable by it in a way they dressed up as concern. I had traded with her twice horses, some dried meat one winter when her stores ran short, before we ever said more than a few words to each other that weren't about the transaction. She was not unfriendly. She was contained. There's a difference. Some people keep you at arm's length because they don't trust you. She kept people at arm's length because she'd learned that arm's length was where you had to keep them if you wanted to stay upright. I recognized it because I'd learned the same thing. My band that year was smaller than it had been. There'd been sickness 3 winters before, the coughing kind, the kind that moves through a camp like fire through dry grass. We lost 11 people, including 2 of the older men who had been my advisors since I was young enough to need advisors badly. After that, I was more alone in the decision-making than I wanted to be, though I had young men I trusted and a few women of middle age who had the kind of judgment that takes decades to grow. We managed. We always managed, but the managing was heavier than it had been. The valley settlers knew enough of our history to treat us with a certain careful respect, which was better than the alternative. Some of them had been here long enough to have traded with my father's band, which helped. They'd seen us behave decently across years. which is really the only argument that works with anybody. A man named Greer who ran cattle 2 miles west of Marta's place always nodded to me when we crossed on the road. An older German couple near the creek had a standing arrangement with us about spring grazing that had held for 6 years without trouble. These things mattered. They were the slow, careful work of keeping peace, and they were my responsibility, and I took them seriously. But they were also not friendships exactly. Something less than that, and more than business. That valley scale hum of people deciding they could coexist. The third time I came to her ranch, it was late autumn, and I was not there to trade. I had a horse with a bad leg. Not my horse, one of the younger men in my band, Hoka. His horse had thrown a shoe and taken a stone bruise deep in the hoof, and he needed to rest it for 2 weeks at least. We were moving camp, couldn't wait. I asked Marta Dillon if she could board the horse. She said yes without much deliberation, named a fair price, and I left Hoka's horse in her corral. When I came back for it 2 weeks later, she had the horse in good shape, the bruising healed, and she'd reshoot it herself. She had a small forge. I hadn't known that. I looked at the shoe and it was good work, clean and even. I said so. She nodded once, like she was accepting a report rather than a compliment. That was when I started to notice her. Not in the way a man notices a woman he wants. Or not only that. I noticed the way she moved, which was efficient and without waste. I noticed her hands, which were strong and scarred in small ways from the forge and the fence wire and the work. I noticed that she looked at me directly, had always looked at me directly, which not everyone did. Some people looked at me and saw the feathers I wasn't wearing, the teepee I wasn't living in, all the things they'd been told a man like me was. She looked at me and saw a man. I don't know if she was aware of doing it, probably she wasn't, but I noticed. I came back in the spring. A different errand. I wanted to look at a piece of fence line she'd put up along the east edge of her property, because there was a question about where exactly the boundary sat, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes rather than argue about a map I hadn't drawn. She walked the line with me. We talked about it plainly, settled it plainly, and then she invited me in for coffee and I said yes. That was the first time I sat in her cabin. It was a plain place. She wasn't a woman for decoration. The table was heavy pine scrubbed clean. The stove was iron and well-maintained. There was a shelf with 3 books on it, a Bible, a medical book, and a third one I couldn't see the title of. There was a photograph on the wall. A man I assumed was her husband, young-looking, standing next to a horse with a stiff formal posture that told me the photograph was the most uncomfortable he'd been in his life. And on the windowsill in a small clay pot, a plant she was keeping alive. Just the one plant. A cutting of something, the green of it bright against the gray light coming off the prairie. We drank coffee. We talked about the fence, about the spring grass, about whether the winter had been harder than the one before. At some point she refilled my cup without asking if I wanted more, which was a small thing, but it was also the first time I registered that she was comfortable with me. Not at ease exactly. She was not a woman who was at ease easily, but comfortable. Like I was someone whose presence she had accepted into the space. I rode back to camp that afternoon with a feeling I didn't examine too closely. I won't tell all of the years between that first cup of coffee and the day I found myself standing in the tree line watching her kneel at the grave. There were other visits. Trade, mostly. At first, then less so. I came because I found reasons to come, and she didn't discourage it. We talked about her cattle and my horses and the weather and the people in the valley and the way the hills looked in different seasons. We didn't talk about anything that sat too deep. I learned that her husband's name had been Peter. She learned that my father had died 3 winters back. That was as far as it went. But I noticed things. Small things that added up the way small things do. The way she assessed a horse, she'd go over the legs first, then the chest, her hands knowing exactly what to feel for and finding it without her face changing expression, all the information going in quiet through her palms. The way she talked about the land she worked, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of responsibility, like she understood she'd been entrusted with something and meant to return it in better shape than she found it. She was putting in trees on the west side of the property, young ones, cottonwood and elm, that wouldn't provide shade worth having for another 20 years. She knew that. She was planting for a future she might not live to need, which struck me as a particular kind of faith I didn't have a name for. One winter I came to trade and there was fresh snow, a foot of it, and I found her up on the roof of the barn with a long-handled broom sweeping the snow off before the weight could do damage. She was up there alone, no one to steady the ladder. I held the ladder without saying anything and she swept the snow and came down and looked at me and said, "You could have said something." I said, "You were almost done." She thought about that and then she said, "Fair." And that was the whole conversation. But I thought about it for a week, the specific matter-of-factness of her. The way she'd assessed the situation and decided fair was the right word for it. I thought about her more than made obvious sense, given how little we actually knew of each other. I thought about this and I had the honesty to acknowledge what it meant, and then I filed it away somewhere internal and didn't do anything with it. What would I have done? The circumstances were what they were: my band, her ranch, the valley with its settled arrangements, the fact that she was a widow in a community that noticed things and talked about them. It would have been a complication of a kind neither of us had asked for, so I didn't do anything with it. I kept coming for the trade and the fence line questions and the occasional cup of coffee, and I kept noticing her, and I kept keeping it to myself. What I did not know until the 5th year was about the grave. I learned it from the woman who ran the dry goods store in town, a woman named Ruth who talked more than she thought about what she was saying. She was telling me something else, about a land dispute, I think, or a water claim, and she mentioned it sideways, the way people mention things they think you probably already know. She said something about how Marta had had a baby that didn't live before she came out here, before Peter even, when she was very young, and every year on that baby's birthday she went somewhere and didn't come out, and that was just Marta, that was her way, and everyone knew to leave her alone that day. I rode home thinking about the plant on the windowsill, the one plant she kept alive, in that cabin that had almost nothing decorative in it. One plant. I didn't say anything to her about it. What would I have said? I'm sorry wasn't enough, and it wasn't mine to say, not really. The grief was older than I was to her life. And I knew something about grief that you can't move toward with words, grief that has been living in a person so long it has become part of the structure, like a beam in the frame of a house. You don't talk about the beam. It's holding the roof up. But the next year, when I knew the date and I had figured it out, not by asking, by paying attention to when she got quietest in the weeks before, I didn't go to her cabin. I stayed away. I told myself that was respect. The year after that, I told myself the same thing. The year I stood in the tree line watching the crow and watching her kneel at the stone was the 8th year I'd known her, and the 10th year since the baby's birthday had been passing alone. I don't know what made that year different. I'm not going to tell you it was a vision or a voice or anything like that, because it wasn't. It was more ordinary than that. I had been awake before dawn, the way I often am, and I was sitting outside my lodge in the cold and I was thinking about my father. He died in the winter, as I said, 3 years before Marta, but I had a habit of missing him most in the spring. He loved the spring, the way the grass came back, and every spring I felt his absence in a particular way, like a sound that's gone but your ears keep expecting to hear it. I was sitting there in the cold thinking about him, and thinking about what he used to say about grief. He said, grief is not a wound heals. Grief is a country, you learn to live in it. And the ones who do not lose their minds in that country are the ones who find someone else living there too. I thought about Marta Dillon, living in that country alone for 10 years. I saddled my horse before sunrise. She was still at the grave when I came out of the trees. She heard the horse and her shoulders tightened, that particular tightening that a person who lives alone learns, not fear exactly, more a preparation, the body getting ready to handle whatever is coming. She didn't stand up. She turned her head enough to see it was me, and then she looked back at the stone. I tied my horse to the fence, and I walked over to the grave. She still didn't stand up. I stood next to her, not close, arm's length like we'd always kept. I looked at the stone. I read the name on it, which I won't say. I looked at the turned dark earth and the crow, which had moved to a nearby post and was watching both of us now. I said, "I don't know if you want company today." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've never had any." "I know," I said. Another quiet. The wind moved the grass beyond the fence in a long wave, like something breathing. She said, "Why today?" I thought about my father. I thought about the right answer and whether there was one. I said, "Because 10 years is a long time to sit alone." She made a small sound, not a word, not quite a cry. Something in between those, something that came out of a place so far down, I don't think she'd planned for it to come out at all. She put her hand over her mouth, and she sat there with her hand over her mouth and her eyes closed for a while, and I stood next to her, and I didn't move and I didn't say anything else. After a while she took her hand down. She was composed again, or mostly. Her eyes were red but dry. She looked at the stone. She said her name was Clara. And just like that, I knew the name. Clara. The name she'd been carrying alone for 10 years and had never said to anyone who stayed. "Clara," I said, not repeating it back at her, just saying it, acknowledging that I'd heard it, that the name was in the air now and not just inside her. She nodded once, very small. We stayed there a while longer, the two of us, until the cold in the ground started coming up through her knees. I could tell because she shifted, just slightly, and I offered her my hand and she took it and stood up. Her hand was cold and rough from the morning air and the years of fence wire and forge work, and she held mine for a moment after she was upright, not because she needed to, I think, but because she was surprised to find that she hadn't let go yet. Then she let go. She said, "I was going to make biscuits, if you want some." I said I did. We went inside. The cabin was warm from the stove she'd stoked before she came out. The plant was still on the windowsill, the same plant or a new cutting of the same kind. I'd watched her take cuttings from it over the years and start new ones, so there were now 2 plants on the sill. The photograph of Peter was still on the wall. She moved around the cabin with her usual efficiency, getting the flour, the lard, the bowl, her hands knowing exactly where everything was without her eyes needing to find it. I sat at the table. She worked and I watched, and for a while neither of us said anything, and the nothing we said was a different kind of nothing than the silences we'd had before. Before, the silences between us were comfortable but also careful, both of us staying on the surface of ourselves. This silence was different. Something had come down a notch. After a while she said, without turning from the counter, "Did you know, before today?" "Yes," I said, "I've known for a few years." She was quiet, processing that. "Why didn't you come before?" "I thought you wanted to be left alone." "I did," she said. She shaped the biscuits, put them in the pan, slid the pan into the oven. She leaned against the counter and looked at me. "And I didn't, both." "I understand that." She studied me. She had gray in her hair that hadn't been there when I first came to trade at her place. I had gray at my temples that hadn't been there either. We were both older. There was something almost funny in that if you looked at it from far enough away, 2 people who had been carefully not talking to each other for years while they both got older. She said, "You lost your father 3 winters back. You don't talk about it." "No." "Do you have someone you talk about it to?" I thought about that honestly. "Not really," I said. She nodded, like that was the information she needed. She poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table and sat down across from me. This was different from how we usually sat. She usually stood for part of the conversation, moving around, the work giving her something to do with her hands. Today she sat down and put her hands around her cup and looked at me. She said, "Tell me about him." I looked at her. "Your father," she said, "tell me what he was like." And there it was, the thing I hadn't known I needed until someone asked for it. I had been carrying my father the same way she'd been carrying Clara, not unable to speak of him in general terms, but unable to say the true things, the specific things, the ones that would make him real in the air between two people, the ones you need to say to make the grief a country instead of a wound. I told her about him. I took a breath and I started, and I told her about the way he used to sit with his back to a rock and watch the sunrise like it was personally addressed to him. I told her about the time he traded 3 horses for a pair of boots that didn't fit him because the boots were beautiful, and he felt that beauty was worth something regardless of its use. I told her about his voice, which was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that made a conversation feel like it had all the time in the world. I told her about the last time I saw him, which was not dramatic. He was sick by then. We knew it. But the last conversation we had was about a particular creek that runs good water in the spring, and neither of us said anything about it being the last conversation, because you never know for certain which one that is until it's done. She listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer comparison or comfort of the verbal kind. She sat with her hands around her cup and she listened, and her listening was the most complete listening I had ever been on the receiving end of. When I was done, she said, "He sounds like a man worth grieving." I said he was. The biscuits were done. She got up and took them out. We ate them at the table with more coffee, and she told me about Clara not in one speech but in pieces, the way you tell something that you've never told before, feeling for the edge of it. Clara was born early, born and gone in the same hour, the same breath almost. She'd been 19, alone. She wouldn't tell me the full circumstances of that aloneness, and I didn't ask. She just said, alone, and a young doctor who was kind but helpless, and then a very long winter, and then eventually she met Peter, and Peter had known about Clara and had been a decent man about it. And when he died too, she was left with both of them, both griefs, Clara and Peter, the whole accumulated weight of the people she'd loved who weren't there anymore. She said, "I stopped going to church after Clara. I don't say that as a complaint. I just stopped believing that the kind of God you could sit in a room and talk to was a God that would let a baby die in an hour without being held." I said, "My people don't think of it that way exactly." "No. The ones we lose, they go ahead. They don't leave. They go ahead and wait." She was quiet. "Then, I've heard people say things like that, and it never helped before. Does it help now?" She considered it. "A little," she said, "maybe." The morning moved. She didn't seem to need me to go, and I didn't seem to need to leave. She fed the horses, and I helped her carry a split fence rail she'd been meaning to replace on the south side. I held one end, and she nailed the other. We didn't talk much while we worked. There is a thing that happens when you work alongside someone, something different from talking to them. Talking, you're managing the conversation, thinking about the next thing, aware of the impression you're making. Working together, you forget all that. You're just two people solving a problem, your attention on the thing that needs doing, and in the gaps between the actual tasks you see each other differently. I watched her drive a nail. She had a good swing, efficient, no wasted motion, not the kind of swing that needs power because it makes up for bad aim. 3 strikes and the nail was set. She moved to the next one without pausing. I thought, this woman has been doing everything on this place by herself for years. Every nail, every rail, every dawn feeding in weather that would have kept most people inside. And she hadn't done it with resentment, or not primarily. She'd done it because it was the work and the work needed doing, and there was something in her that was built for that, that had maybe always been built for it, even if no one had told her that was what she was built for. She drove the last nail and stood back and looked at the rail. She said, "It's a little low on the left." I looked, 1/4 inch maybe. "I'll take it out and reset it." Or you can leave it, and the next one will compensate. She considered that, looked along the fence line, looked back at the rail. I'll leave it, she said, in a tone that made clear this was a compromise she was making consciously and wasn't entirely happy about. I did not smile, but it was close. After that we walked the east pasture because she'd seen a section of the ground that was soft in a way that concerned her, some kind of spring seeping up that could make trouble for the cattle's hooves. I looked at it and told her what I knew about drainage, which was something my father had taught me. She listened and asked questions and then made her own assessment, which was as good as mine. We ate the rest of the biscuits at midday with dried beef she had. The light by then had moved from morning gray to that flat afternoon yellow that the prairie gets, low clouds, the hills going a kind of brown gold. We sat on her porch steps and ate and looked out at it. She said, "Nobody's ever stayed before." I said, "On this day, you mean?" "On this day." Or much past that. She held the biscuit in her hands and looked at it. "People tend to leave." "I know." She looked at me. "Is that why you stayed? Because you thought I needed the company?" I looked back at her. "Partly," I said, "and partly because I did." Something moved in her face. Something she wasn't trying to hide exactly, just hadn't planned on showing. She looked back out at the hills. After a while she said quietly, "Good." That was all, just good. But the way she said it had a weight to it, a solid weight, the kind that doesn't get added unless someone means it. The afternoon wore on the way afternoons do when you're not watching the time. We talked more. She told me about where she'd come from, Pennsylvania, a farm, a father who worked hard and drank harder, and a mother who was small and strong the way a root is strong. She'd come west with Peter because Peter had a dream, and she had nothing to keep her where she was. She said the West hadn't given her much of what she'd been told to expect, and had given her plenty she hadn't expected. I asked her what she meant by that. She said she'd expected beauty and difficulty, and she'd gotten both, but she'd also gotten a particular kind of quiet that she hadn't known she was starving for. The quiet you can only find when you're far enough from the places people have built up. I told her I understood that. I told her the hills in winter had a quiet to them that I had never found anywhere else. She nodded like she'd been waiting for someone to say that. Toward late afternoon she went inside and came back with something wrapped in cloth. She set it down between us on the step and then unwrapped it, and it was a piece of cake. A small one, plain white cake, the kind you'd make for a celebration. She cut it in half with her knife and gave me half and kept half. I looked at it. She said, "I make one every year." She'd be 11 this year. I looked at the cake in my hand. This piece of cake she'd baked for a daughter who'd lived an hour, who had never tasted anything, who would have been 11 years old. I didn't say anything. I ate the piece of cake. She ate hers. It was a good cake, plain and honest the way she made everything. The sun was getting low. The shadows from the hills came across the grass in long bars. I should have gone an hour ago, by any practical reckoning. But she hadn't asked me to go, and something in the quality of the silence between us had changed again, had gotten slower and more settled, the way water in a pool settles after the disturbance. She said, "I want to say something, and I need you to not make it into more than I mean it to be, and also not less." I waited. "Today mattered," she said. "You staying today. It mattered to me more than I would have thought anything could, and I don't know what to do with that yet, but I wanted you to know it." I held that. She was looking at her hands. I said, "I came today because 10 years is long enough to be alone in a grief. And because I wanted to tell someone about my father, and I didn't know that until I got here." I paused. "I'll come back, if that's all right." She looked at me then. Looked at me directly, the way she always had, but now there was something in it that she wasn't trying to put away. She said, "Yes." "Not if you want to. Not, I suppose, just yes." I nodded. The crow had come back to the fence post. It called once, just once, and then flew off into the low evening sky in the direction of the hills. We both watched it go. I got up from the step and went to my horse. She came with me to the fence, and I checked the saddle, and then I turned, and she was standing there with her arms crossed, not against the cold. I didn't think. It was a kind of holding herself, the way people stand when they have been opened up by a day and need to keep their shape. I looked at her. She was plain-looking and strong-looking, and she had gray in her hair and laugh lines that didn't come from laughing much, and her eyes were the color of good creek water, not blue exactly, more gray-green, and she was looking at me with something that wasn't quite anything I'd seen on her face before. She said, "Next year don't wait until I'm already at the grave." Something moved in my chest. That same thing I'd felt in the morning in the tree line, the one I didn't have a word for. But it had changed shape. The morning version was grief adjacent. This one was closer to something I hadn't felt in years. "I'll be here before sunrise," I said. She nodded once. I rode home through the evening hills. I did not go straight to my lodge. I rode to the ridge above the valley, and I stopped my horse and sat there a while, looking back the way I'd come. Her cabin was a small square of light in the darkening flat below, the smoke from her stove rising straight up in the still air, no wind. I sat there until the light in the cabin went amber. She'd lit the lamp, and then I turned my horse and rode down the other side of the ridge toward camp. I thought about the piece of cake in my hand, the way she'd cut it in two and handed me half without explaining it, as if it was obvious, as if of course you would share the birthday cake for a girl who hadn't lived to taste anything. I had not told her about my daughter, 3 years old, one arm a little higher when she ran. I had said nothing of her today because it hadn't been today's business. Today had been about Clara, about the 10 years of alone. But I thought, I will tell her. Next time or the time after, I'll tell her. She'll want to know. She'll listen the way she listened to me talk about my father, completely, with no part of her going somewhere else. That was what I hadn't had. Not just comfort, not just company, somebody who stayed all the way in the room. There is a feeling you get when you have been somewhere all day and that somewhere has changed you. It's not a loud feeling. It's quiet. It sits in your ribs like something warm. I hadn't felt it in a long time. My father's death had left a particular coldness in me that I'd gotten used to, the way you get used to a draft through a gap in the wall. You stop noticing it except on the worst nights, and then you feel it all the way in your bones. Riding back that evening, the draft was gone. Not because anything was fixed. Nothing was fixed. My father was still dead. Her daughter was still in the ground by the cabin. The grief was still the country we both lived in. But I'd found someone else living there. That winter was hard. They always were in those hills. There was a week in January where the temperature dropped to something beyond cold. The word cold stopped applying, and you were just in something else, something hostile and absolute. My band moved to the lower valley and we made do. I thought about Marta. I didn't go to her in the worst of it. The trails weren't safe and she was capable. She had enough wood and enough stores, I knew that. But I thought about the light in her cabin window, and I thought about her hands around a coffee cup, and I thought about the word she'd said, good, with all its weight. I thought about Clara, the name in the air between us. I had a daughter who died at 3 years old, not stillborn. She'd lived long enough to have a name she answered to, long enough to have a way of running that was particular to her, one arm always slightly higher than the other. Her mother and I, that was a long time ago and a long story, and not this one. But I had not spoken my daughter's name to anyone in years. I had done the same thing Marta had done, put the grief somewhere deep and built over it, kept moving. You keep moving. I thought about what it had felt like to say my father's real stories out loud. The one about the boots, the one about the spring creek. I hadn't known how much those stories needed to be said until they were in the air. Grief is a country, my father had told me. You learn to live in it. And the ones who survive in that country are the ones who find someone else living there too. I lay in my lodge in the January cold and I thought, I have found someone else. In February I went. The trails had cleared enough. I had venison, more than we needed, and that was the official reason. She came out when she heard the horse and stood on the porch with her breath making clouds in the cold air, and she looked at me like she'd been expecting me. Even though she couldn't have been, I'd sent no word. She said, "I made coffee this morning and made too much." I said, "That's convenient." She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile the full way. She'd done partial smiles, controlled ones, but this one moved her whole face, just for a moment, and then it settled back into her usual expression. I unsaddled my horse and put him in her corral, and we went inside and drank the leftover coffee that she heated back up on the stove. We talked about the winter, about a calf she'd nearly lost in a freeze, about a family 2 valleys over who'd come through and traded supplies for shelter. After a while, we stopped talking about anything in particular and just sat. I looked at the windowsill. She'd added a 3rd plant. I said, "New one." She looked, cutting from the second. The second came from the first. "What kind?" "Lemon balm." She looked at it. "My mother grew it. I brought the first cutting with me when I left Pennsylvania, wrapped in wet cloth inside my boot." She paused. "Peter used to say I cared more about that plant than I cared about him." She said it without sadness. It was just a thing that had been said once, a long time ago, by a man who was gone. I said, "Did you?" She thought about it. "It's older," she said. That was such a completely Marta thing to say that I found myself laughing. A real laugh from down in my chest, the kind I hadn't had much cause for. She looked at me, surprised, and then she was laughing too, not loudly but genuinely, and for a moment the cabin was a different place, lighter, the cold outside a little less absolute. The laughing settled. She was looking at me across the table with that look again, the one I didn't have a category for. She said, "I missed you, this winter. I thought about that and it surprised me." I said, "I thought about you too." She nodded. She looked at her cup. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I'm telling you that plainly because I think you should know it. I've been alone a long time. I don't know if I've forgotten how to let someone in or if I never really knew." "I don't know how to do it either," I said. "Our circumstances are not simple." She looked up. "No," she said, "they're not." She considered. "Does that bother you?" "Does it bother you?" She held my gaze. I asked first. "No," I said. "The complicated things don't bother me. The simple things do." She tilted her head. "Simple loneliness," I said. "That bothers me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's right. That's exactly right." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Not a romantic gesture, not then, something more plain than that, more serious. Like a confirmation. Like she was putting her hand down on an agreement. I turned my hand over and held hers. We sat like that for a while, her hand in mine, both of us looking at nothing in particular, the stove ticking, the cold pressing at the windows. That was the winter. Spring came, and then summer, and I won't try to make it sound like we figured it out easily because we didn't. There was a month in the spring where I didn't come. I won't say why, it was band business, a dispute with a group moving through the eastern hills that needed to be handled carefully and slowly, and I was the one who had to handle it. When I finally came back to her place in late May, she was in the south pasture moving cattle, and she saw me from a distance and raised one hand, a simple acknowledgement, and went back to what she was doing. I helped her move the cattle. We didn't say much until it was done. When we came in, she said, "I thought maybe you weren't coming back." I said I would. She looked at me. "I know what you said." She turned away and started the stove. "I also know that things change." "They do," I said. "I had obligations that took time. That will happen again." She was quiet, her back to me. I said, "I'll tell you when I can. When I can't tell you ahead of time, I'll tell you after." She turned around. Her expression was not hard but very direct. She was thinking about something. Then she said, "All right," just that, "all right." And she meant it. She wasn't saying it to end the conversation. She was saying it because she decided it was acceptable. She'd thought it through in those few seconds and made a decision. That was one of the things I came to understand about her. She didn't dither. She decided. In the summer there was talk in the valley. Some of it was just curiosity, which is human enough. Some of it was hostile. A man named Carver, who ran a feed operation at the south end of the valley, made a point of saying something within my hearing about what kind of woman would spend time with and then the word he used, which I won't repeat here. I looked at him. He looked away first. It didn't go further than that, but I knew it had been heard by others. I told Marta about it because I thought she should know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Carver owes the bank money he won't have by fall. He needs someone to blame for every wrong thing in his life, and he rotates through candidates." She looked at me. "Does it bother you?" "Does it bother you?" I asked. "I've been talked about before. I'm a widow who runs her own cattle and doesn't go to church and doesn't remarry when everyone tells her to." She shrugged, a small controlled movement. "One more thing for them to talk about won't break me. It might make your life harder." She said, "Chayton." She almost never used my name directly. She usually just talked to me without preamble. I'm not in the habit of making decisions based on what Carver thinks about them. I said, "No, I didn't think you were." She gave me a look that had something wry in it, something almost amused. "Good," she said, that word again, same weight. There were things that needed navigating, what people would say, and people did say things in the valley on both sides, though fewer than I'd expected. Most people had enough of their own problems to spend much time on ours. There were things that needed to be learned slowly, each of us learning the other the way you learn terrain, which way the water drains, where the ground goes soft, where it's solid even in the worst weather. There were days I came to her cabin and we barely spoke, both tired from our separate labors and content to be in the same space, without needing the space to be filled. There were days we talked until the lamp burned low. There were disagreements, serious ones. She had opinions as firm as her fence posts, and so did I. And we learned, slowly, which disagreements needed to be resolved and which could just be two people living with a difference between them. What I can tell you is this: she never tried to make me into something else. I've heard men talk about this, the way people they get close to start trying to smooth them into a different shape, more convenient, more expected. Marta didn't do that. She took me as I came, the chief, the Lakota man, the man with 2 languages and a band of people who depended on him, the man with his own grief and his own obligations and his own ways of moving through the world. She took all of that, and she didn't ask me to set any of it down. And I didn't ask her to be any different than she was, which meant I also didn't ask her to be easier. She was not easy, she was good. Those are not the same thing. The 2nd October, after that first day at the grave, she was sick. A chest sickness, not dangerous in the end but bad for about 2 weeks. She couldn't do the outside work, barely had the energy to feed the stove. I came and stayed, slept in the barn on a bedroll I brought from camp. In the mornings I did the outside work, fed and watered and checked the fence, brought in wood. And then I came inside and sat with her, and sometimes she slept and sometimes she didn't, and when she was awake we talked or we didn't. On the 4th day she was awake when I came in from the morning chores, and she looked at me from the bed with a clarity in her eyes that the fever had burned away, and she said, "I've been thinking about you sitting with me." I sat down. She said, "When I was sick as a girl there was nobody to sit with me. My mother did what she could, but there were 4 of us and she was always busy, and my father," she stopped, started again. "I used to lie in bed and wish for someone to just be there, not to do anything, just to be there." I said, "I'm here." She looked at me. Her hair was loose and her face was pale from the sickness, and she looked not young exactly, but younger than she usually let herself appear, some of the long-practiced composure worn down to something more unguarded. She said, "I know," a pause. "That's what I was thinking about, that you're here." I reached over and put my hand on her forehead, just that. Check the temperature the way you do. It was down from the night before, which was good. She closed her eyes at the touch, not dramatically, just let them close, the way you close your eyes when something is exactly enough. I took my hand away. She opened her eyes. She said, "Stay today." I stayed. She recovered. Another week and she was back to full force, which with Marta meant something. Full force was a considerable thing. On the day she was well enough to come outside, she walked the fence with me, and we checked every section, and made a list of what needed mending in the spring. It was November by then, the hills already going silver at the top where the frost held overnight. Our breath was visible, and the grass was stiff. She walked beside me with her hands in her coat pockets, and her eyes moving over the fence the way a builder's eyes move over a structure they're responsible for. She said without stopping walking, "I want to tell you something." "All right." She walked another few steps. "I'm not going to be good at this," she said. "I'm not going to say things the right way a lot of the time. I'll say too little when I mean a lot, and sometimes I'll say the wrong thing when I mean something else entirely." She stopped and turned to face me. "But I want you to know that I am," she looked for the word, found it. "Decided," she said. "About you, about this. I'm not uncertain, and I'm not afraid, and I'm not doing this because I'm lonely and would do it with anyone. I'm doing it because it's you." She held my gaze. "I want you to know that." The hills stood the way hills stand. The frost white at the top, the brown gold below. The sky that exact winter sky color, clean and pale and cold. I said, "I know it." She said, "Good. I just wanted to say it out loud." "So did I said. She looked at me for a moment, and in that look was everything. The 10 years she'd spent alone with a grief and a grave and a plant on the windowsill, and the years of watching people leave, and the careful learned distance she'd put between herself and everyone who came near, and the morning I came out of the tree line and stood next to her at the stone, and Clara's name in the air, and my father's voice, and the coffee, and the cake, and the word good, and the winter, and her hand over mine on the table. All of it. She took my hand the way she had across the table that first winter, except we were outside now, standing in the cold between the fence and the hills, and she held it and looked at me, and something in her face had let go of a long tension, some long-held set of her jaw, and she looked, not relieved exactly, settled, like a person who has been carrying something a long way and has finally put it down in a place where it belongs. I pulled her close, not dramatically. I just pulled her in, and she let me, and she leaned into me with her head at my shoulder and her hand flat against my chest, and we stood there in the cold November field with the frost hills behind us and the cabin in front of us, and the small dark mound of earth near the east wall with its flat stone, and I held her, and I was the warmest I'd been in years. We stood like that for a while, long enough for the wind to pick up a little and move her hair, long enough for the crow, I'm sure it was the same crow, I know that's not rational, to come and sit on the fence post and tilt its head at us, and then fly off again toward the hills. She said against my shoulder, "She would have liked you." I said, "What makes you say that?" "She would have liked anyone who could sit still long enough to hear the grass grow, a beat. Not many people can." I thought about my father, about the way he used to sit with his back against a rock and watch the sunrise like it was addressed to him personally. He could have sat still long enough for anything. I said my father could. She lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were wet, just at the edges, not from sadness exactly, from the accumulated weight of things being all right after a long time of them not being. She said, "Tell me more about him, on the way back." "All right," I said. We turned and walked back toward the cabin, her hand still in mine, the frost crunching under our boots. I started talking about my father. I told her about the boots. She laughed, that real full laugh again, the one that moved her whole face. I told her about the spring creek, the last conversation. She listened without filling the silence after I stopped. She knew when to leave silence alone. Then she said, quiet, That sounds like a good last thing to talk about, something he loved. Yes, I said. We were close to the cabin door. She stopped and looked up at me, one hand still in mine, the other hand on the door latch. The amber light from inside came through the gap at the edge of the door, a thin line of warmth. She said, "I'm glad you came out of those trees." I said, "So am I." She pushed the door open, and the warmth came out and we went inside. The cabin smoke went up straight in the still cold air. The hills stood the way hills stand. Her hand was in mine, and mine was warm.